Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Rural Research Symposium. All lines are in listen-only mode. Today's sessions are being recorded and will be available to watch on demand after the conference has concluded. If you have any questions during the sessions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You will also find links to the speakers' bios and the presentation decks there as well. Lastly, if you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A box and someone will assist you. With that, I'd like to welcome Senior Director of Affordable Lending, Simone Beatty.
Thank you, and hello. I'm Simone Beatty, Senior Director of Freddie Mac's Single Family Affordable Lending Strategy. I, along with the Affordable Lending team, lead the efforts for our Single Family Duty to Serve activities. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to Day 2 of Freddie Mac's Rural Research Symposium. I hope that you enjoyed yesterday's sessions as much as I did. During Day 1, we gained insights into macroeconomic trends and how they affect the housing market, as well as some of the strengths, continuing needs, and solutions for advancing rural economies and households from a geographic point of view. We also learned about the effects of natural disasters on migration patterns and housing, and paths to creating more sustainable homeownership opportunities. And we heard from our keynote speaker, Catherine Eden of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, where she shared perspectives on how poverty impacts housing. Day 2 promises to be full of equally meaningful and useful information. Because the symposium is intended to raise the visibility of research, to highlight not only the challenges, but also the opportunities within the rural housing market. It is also intended to encourage collaboration across the rural housing ecosystem and spur ideas for new solutions, actions, and future research. Today, we'll delve into factors influencing housing affordability, particularly when it comes to rental housing for rural households. But first up, let me introduce Lariece Brown, Senior Director of Freddie Mac's Single Family Quantitative Analytics, who will moderate our panel discussion on the intersection of the factory-built housing market, policy, and health. This is an important conversation, given the critical shortage of affordable homes nationwide and manufactured housing's potential to help close that gap. After all, home is the foundation of our lives, and everyone deserves to have adequate, affordable housing. By continuing to work together, we can make home possible. And now, I will turn it over to Lariece.
Thank you, Simone, for that introduction and that welcome today. Hello, everyone. My name is Lariece Brown. I'm an economist and senior director in the Single Family Mission and Community Development Department. Welcome again as we kick off Day 2 of our Rural Research Symposium with this session on Into the Future, Manufactured Housing Opportunities. Our presenters today will provide a perspective of the future of manufactured housing, its importance for affordability and housing supply, considerations for the potential impact of policy, and bring light to key data sources and considerations that continue to help us understand this segment of the market. First, we'll have Lesli Gooch, Chief Executive Officer for the Manufactured Housing Institute, to lead the discussion with a view from the perspective of the potential millennial homebuyer. Then we'll have Helen Banga, an economist with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, share her working paper on the interplay of market power and price regulation. After Helen, Elena Falcettoni will present information on the lessons learned when analyzing available data sources, with an important focus on distinctions in the types of factory-built homes that might be missed with commonly used data sources. Helena is a senior economist with the Federal Reserve Board. We round out this session with Freddie Mac economist Astou discussing her research on manufactured housing and rural area loan performance before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. As we dive into this content, Please note that you may use the chat feature to ask questions of our presenters. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Lesli, our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Lariece, and thank you all for the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Lesli Gooch. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Manufactured Housing Institute, and we've been doing work to really look at the opportunities for manufactured housing in today's market with a focus on the younger consumer. And so we have some research that we would like to share with you today, really looking at the starting point, the housing landscape. And I don't need to tell anyone who's participating today that the U.S. is experiencing a housing crisis, and it's about housing supply. Home prices are unaffordable, inventory is low, and inflation and mortgage rates and the concern of recession has really impacted affordability. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the pre-existing inequities in access to affordable housing, as we saw increasing demand for work from home spaces, driving competition among home buyers, and a rapid increase in home prices. So this research that we'd like to share with you today is really about younger consumers who found themselves priced out of the housing market, and the concern is that they are often delaying homeownership. Millennials and younger consumers are increasingly open to manufactured homes as a housing option. And we see this as a real opportunity and something that we want to focus on as we try to expand attainable homeownership in America. The openness is really driven in this shift in attitudes about manufactured housing in general and a desire for affordable homeownership. Younger consumers are increasingly attracted to rural areas where the cost of living is lower than urban centers. And so you have those two factors with the supply of affordable quality manufactured homes being attractive for younger consumers, lined up with their interest in moving to areas where the cost of living is lower. So this research that we're presenting today is really looking at where we are in terms of housing affordability and where the opportunity is for manufactured housing. And so I'd like to begin with some of the research that is currently out there that talks about how homeownership has become increasingly expensive for many consumers today. The average cost of a new site-built home is in the $460,000 range. It's actually higher today when you look at 2022. That number's from 21. Moody's Home Price Index shows a 32% rise in prices nationally over the last 2 years. As of the first week of September, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage averaged 5.66%. And we know that that's even higher today. That compares to 2.87% in September of 2021. And of course, this calculates into an increase of roughly $500 more per monthly payment on a median priced home. Redfin reported that in May of 2022, the median monthly asking rent in the US was over $2,000, which is a 15% year-over-year increase. And in the most expensive markets in the country, the year-over-year rent increases range from almost 25% to almost 50%. So current estimates suggest the US has a housing supply deficit of 3.8 million units. So here we have a housing supply deficit and we have increasing housing costs, which doesn't really look very good for the millennial consumers who are our next generation of home buyers. Millennial Americans are the largest living demographic in the United States at 72.1 million individuals. Just as a definitional point for you, Generation Z are those individuals born between 1997 and 2012, millennials between 1981 and 1996, and then, of course, Gen X, the individuals born between 1965 and 1980. As housing prices have continued to increase nearly 20% year over year as of early 2022, millennials have increasingly been priced out of housing markets. Millennials lag other generations in home ownership Just under half of the millennials are homeowners today. And for Gen Xers, the homeownership rate is closer to 70%. And baby boomers, the homeownership rate is close to 80%. Millennial consumers are experiencing the effects of inflation differently. Consumers who signed a new rental lease in July 2022 experienced rent increases like we've already talked about, and also increases in the cost of goods and services compared to the overall population. As a consumer group, millennials express broadly positive attitudes toward manufactured housing, while 2/3 of millennials surveyed report they are likely to consider purchasing a manufactured home in the future. And we're excited about that opportunity. Today's manufactured homes offer quality and attainable homeownership with all of the features that millennials are seeking today. And that's really had an impact. This symposium is about rural America. And in talking about rural America today, we know that there has been growing levels of in-migration over the past few years to those rural areas. The COVID-19 pandemic really spurred a dramatic increase in home prices, as I said, and constrained levels of inventory really shifted for people to leave the larger cities and metropolitan areas and look for more affordable markets. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, the migration into smaller towns and rural areas doubled from 2020 to 2021. There were less than 10,000 monthly migrants leaving high-cost areas for more rural environments at the beginning of 2020, but monthly immigration increased to more than 20,000 in 2021. In 2019, 40% of non-metropolitan counties represented by large rural areas experienced net in-migration. By 2021, the share of non-metropolitan counties experiencing in-migration had increased to 66%. In a survey of older millennial consumers living in large cities, 37% reported that they wanted to relocate to a smaller town, primarily as a means for cutting down on costs. And similarly, 36% of parents and consumers saving for a down payment reported they want to move to a smaller town. And younger Americans, we see, according to a Pew Research Center study, are the ones that are most likely to move. You'll see on this chart that young adults are more likely than any other age group to move from one home to another by a large percentage. So manufactured homes are really an opportunity for this younger home buyer who's really looking for a quality alternative and something that is attainable for them at an attainable price point. In 2021, our industry produced over 105,000 new homes, which accounted for approximately 9% of new single-family home starts. The average sales price for a new manufactured home was $108,000 in 2021. And when you compare that to the average sales price of a site-built home without land, that's $365,000 for the site-built home. So you see that the average cost of a site-built home is over 100% higher than a manufactured home. On average, manufactured homes are half the price of site-built homes per square foot. Manufactured homes average $72 per square foot. Site-built homes cost about $144 per square foot. And so it's really, our homes are really offering an affordable price point as we see across the board average sales prices of homes going up in this current market. There has been research conducted. Freddie Mac had research. There was just research introduced as well from another source that looks at shifting perceptions of manufactured housing, particularly among younger consumers. A majority of the consumers that Freddie Mac surveyed said that manufactured housing was a great option for them. 2/3 of the consumers also believe that manufactured homes are affordable without compromising on quality. And among millennials, the positive sentiment was even higher. you had 78% reporting a positive view of manufactured homes, and you had among Generation Z close to 76% of the Generation Z population excited and having positive sentiment about manufactured homes. In fact, 20% of the millennials reported an extremely positive perception of manufactured housing, and both millennials at 68% and Gen Z at 60% indicated that they were more likely to consider purchasing a manufactured home in the future. So at MHI, we said, okay, from all of this knowledge that we have collected, how are the attitudes and actions of millennials and younger consumers more broadly changing as they relate to manufactured housing? Are these consumers actually participating in the manufactured housing marketplace today? And similarly, how is this related to younger consumers favoring rural areas where the cost of living is lower than in urban centers? Are home buyers moving to these rural environments? Are these areas where manufactured housing a viable and desired option? So in order to look at this, we analyzed data from a few different sources. We looked at the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act database, the American Housing Survey, the Census Bureau's Manufactured Housing Survey, and MHI's monthly economic reports. And we asked the following questions. Who is buying manufactured homes, and where are the consumers who purchase manufactured homes living? So in terms of who's buying manufactured homes, it's very interesting to see that based on the HMDA data, that younger consumers hold a higher proportion of manufactured home mortgages than older home buyers. And on this chart, what you see is a percentage of total mortgages by housing type and by age. In the green, you see ownership of site-built homes, and then in purple, you see the percentage of ownership in manufactured housing. So look at the 25 to 34-year-olds, and 25% have achieved homeownership through manufactured housing compared to 18% when it comes to site-built. And so we think that that's really an exciting show that there is definitely less of a stigma toward manufactured homes among those consumers. Consumers under the age of 44 account for 54% of all manufactured home mortgages. So this is kind of breaking down the slide that I just showed you, but there's a large share of mortgages that are going to that consumer, the younger consumer today, for manufactured home ownership. Consumers between 25 and 44 are a part of a continuing trend that are choosing to live in manufactured housing. So we looked at the HMDA data, and we looked at mortgages for manufactured housing by age group from 2018 to 2021, and you'll see that this trend is increasing and continuing for those consumers between 25 and 44. Millennial consumers outpace the national average for the percentage increase in manufactured housing mortgages as well. And so if you look there, you can see that there's not the stigma of the past when it comes to ownership of manufactured homes, which we're excited about. And we really do attribute to the quality of our homes and the attractiveness of the houses, the design, where today's features that are desired are contained. So where are the manufactured home buyers living? What we see here is from the MHI monthly economic report, and then also the US Census Bureau, where the states that are receiving the largest numbers of manufactured homes are largely rural states. And so if you look at where our shipments are going in 2021, where manufactured homes were being sent, and then you compare it to rural populations across the country, you can see that there's a real parallel between those rural populations and where our houses are going. These are the states that are the top 10 for shipments of manufactured homes. And then states with high levels of domestic migration and large rural populations also lead in the percentage of manufactured housing as a percentage of total occupied housing units. You look at these rankings for shipments and you look at the net domestic migration numbers here, and it really does tell a story about where people are going when they're leaving the cities, and they're going to states that lead in the percentage of manufactured housing in those states. Also, states with high domestic migration have seen consistent growth in manufactured housing. So as people are moving to these states, you see that manufactured housing has become an option for them, that they're excited about achieving homeownership through today's manufactured homes. States with high domestic migration have seen consistent growth. If you look at our states here on the left, Florida, Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, South Carolina, look at the percentage increase in manufactured housing shipments from 2015 to 2021. So really what we see is an opportunity. Younger consumers do have enthusiasm for manufactured housing when we survey them, but their attitudes are actually translating into action. Millennials and Gen Z consumers are engaged in the manufactured housing market, which is evidenced by the share of manufactured housing mortgages that they hold relative to other generational cohorts. Data suggests this participation is part of a broader trend of younger consumers purchasing manufactured homes. So given the current economic headwinds, particularly for younger consumers, we really see the opportunity for manufactured housing to provide this affordable alternative to home ownership compared to site-built homes. And then, of course, looking at rural populations, states with larger rural populations have been the leaders in both domestic migration and in terms of shipments of manufactured housing. Conditions in the home buying market are pushing consumers to explore the options outside of population-dense urban areas. Rural areas and smaller towns typically offer more affordable options for housing, both in rental markets and homes for purchase. These environments also provide other benefits such as less density, more green space, private yards, more square footage. So these areas are experiencing high levels of in-migration, particularly in the past year. Similarly, rural areas and smaller towns offer the space for placement of new manufactured homes, and they often have zoning ordinances that are more amenable to manufactured homes. Younger consumers, particularly Gen Z consumers, are concerned with affordability, but they also want to achieve traditional milestones such as homeownership in traditional housing, which manufactured housing offers. Manufactured housing presents an opportunity for millennials and Gen Z to enter the home buying market, especially as they are increasingly priced out of the market of site-built homes. The COVID-19 pandemic was an opportunity for consumers to reevaluate their goals and expectations. And with the proliferation of people working from home, the high costs of urban centers, and the limited housing options available in larger cities, many younger consumers are considering rural environments and smaller towns as the place to make their home. So thank you, Lariece, for the opportunity to present today. We're really excited about manufactured housing and what we can offer in terms of quality homeownership. And we're excited about millennials and younger generations being interested and showing that taking that interest into action in purchasing manufactured homes. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Helen for her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks you for coming to hear about my project, Price Regulation and Market Power, Evidence from Manufactured Home Loans. I started this work in progress during my PhD program, and this is my independent research. The views are mine and do not necessarily represent the views of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or of the United States. I study how the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act rule, which I'll call the HOPA rule for the rest of the presentation, affected borrowers and lenders in the manufactured home loan market. The Bureau issued the rule in 2013, and the rule implemented the Dodd-Frank Act's revisions to HOPA's coverage tests. Specifically, in this paper, I study the APR thresholds imposed by the rule, above which a loan is a high-cost mortgage. In this talk, first I'll discuss the data I use and give a brief overview of the relevant market structure of the manufactured home loan market. Then I'll discuss the effects of the HOPA rule. I'll conclude by discussing a model of supply and demand in the manufactured home loan market that helps us think through the effects of alternative price-based regulations. Before I start describing my project, I'm going to back up for a moment and talk about how my project fits into the broader economics literature. There are a number of papers that study the broader question of whether price-based regulation benefits borrowers. The answer to this question is theoretically ambiguous. On the one hand, price-based regulation can lower prices and borrowers can benefit from cheaper loans. On the other hand, fewer lenders may be willing to offer a loan to a given borrower under price-based regulation, and then a consumer may be worse off if they have fewer loan options. The existing literature reflects this theoretical ambiguity. While a number of papers find positive effects of price-based regulation in, for example, the credit card market, a number of papers also find evidence of consumers being worse off under price-based regulation. Which effect dominates can vary with market structure. For example, Cuesta and Sepulveda find that if the consumer loan market in Chile were a monopoly, borrowers could benefit under an interest rate cap, though in the more competitive market that exists, they were worse off. In this paper, I use the Public Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, known as HMDA. This table presents summary statistics for first lien purchase loans for owner-occupied manufactured homes. I divide the data into two periods because starting in 2018, the HMDA data includes several data points not available in earlier years. Of particular importance for my project is the rate spread variable. This variable is an APR-based measure that shows the distance of the APR from the average prime offer rate, which is expected APR for a borrower with prime credit. So, for example, if the APR of a loan is 9%, and the average prime offer rate for that loan is 4%, then the rate spread reported in HMDA would be 5%. In earlier years, the rate spread was only reported if it was above a threshold, which you'll see in the graph I'll show soon. With the dominant firm variable, I indicate whether the loan was made by one of the two largest lenders who have a common owner. These lenders make many more loans than their nearest competitor, which has raised concern among market observers about market power in this market. Focusing on the issue of concentration in the market specifically, this map shows the market share by county of the dominant firm in 2006 on the eve of the Great Financial Crisis. This map shows that at this point, the dominant firm had a substantial market share, but didn't have a majority market share in a huge number of counties. Moving on to 2013, on the eve of the HOPA rule implementation in 2014, we see a substantial increase in the dominant firm's market share. For example, in Texas, they made a majority of all loans. If we compare raw averages, the dominant firm's loans are substantially more expensive than the average of all other firms. I look at whether the dominant firm charges higher prices given borrower and loan characteristics that we observe in public HMDA. It's important to note that these characteristics don't capture everything that the lender observes about the borrower. I'm simply looking at whether the dominant firm's high prices are explained by variables we do observe, like income, debt-to-income ratio, loan amount, and whether the loan is a chattel loan or manufactured home mortgage. Given the richer data available starting in 2018, I show the results for these later years, but the results for earlier years are similar. The results here show that there's a large rate premium in both the APR-based rate spread and interest rate for the dominant firm. Again, I cannot control for all borrower and loan characteristics, but this analysis shows that the dominant firm's higher prices are not explained by these variables in a regression. The HOPA rule applied to all loans secured by a borrower's principal dwelling, which meant that it applied to both chattel loans and mortgages for manufactured homes. The regulation was implemented for all mortgages, but most of the loans affected by the APR thresholds were for manufactured homes. The regulation states that a loan is a high-cost mortgage if 1. The points and fees exceed 5% of the loan amount for loans greater than $20,000. 2. If the rate spread is over 6.5% for loans greater than or equal to $50,000, or if the rate spread is over 8.5% for loans less than $50,000. 3, if there is a prepayment penalty of more than 2% after 36 months. I'll be focusing on the APR thresholds in this project. I should note that the higher threshold for loans under $50,000 only applies to chattel loans. I can't distinguish between chattel loans and mortgages before 2018 in HMDA. However, mortgages under $50,000 for manufactured homes are relatively rare. In 2018, over 80% of loans under $50,000 were chattel loans. Though the APR threshold does not ban making a loan above the threshold, I will show in the next 2 slides that firms chose to make few loans above the APR threshold. This graph shows the distribution of rate spreads for loans made by the dominant firm in 2013 and 2014. Note that in these years, rate spread was only reported if it was at least 1.5 percentage points above the prime offer rate. We can see that a large number of loans are offered right at the APR thresholds, reflected by the bunching seen in the graph. The number of loans made in 2013 and 2014 is very similar. At least from looking at the rate spread, it appears that the dominant firm was able to make more loans at prices that fell below the APR thresholds in 2013 and then 2013, while making a similar number of loans overall. This graph shows the rate spread for loans made in 2013 and 2014 for all other firms. We can see that the mass of the distribution is lower, and while we can observe a small amount of bunching at the 8.5% threshold, most loans had low enough rates to be unaffected by the HOPE APR threshold. About 90% of loans made in 2013 that would have been above the APR thresholds were made by the dominant firm. Though the histogram suggests that borrowers may have paid lower prices without a concurrent fall in supply, it's possible that firms adjusted on other margins to compensate for lower prices. For example, firms could increase loan sizes to make up for lower APRs or lend to less risky borrowers to lower costs. I don't see evidence of this in the data. Benzardi 2021 is the only other academic paper I'm aware of that looks at this for the HOPE rule, and he finds no evidence of this kind of change in the wider mortgage market either. For some variables, like loan fees and loan term, I only have data starting in 2018 when the greater number of HMDA variables became available. In that case, I look at whether, for example, there's a spike in loan term at the threshold, which could potentially compensate for lower APRs. I don't observe this happening. It's possible that firms adjusted on other margins, like late fees, that I don't observe in the HMDA data. However, the significant lobbying effort from industry for a higher APR threshold suggests that it was a perceived constraint. In the last part of this section, I use an event study regression, which allows me to directly control for the factors like borrower income and loan amount. I compare loans that are within 75 basis points of the thresholds or higher as the quote treated group to all other loans, which are the control group. In the results of the event study, we see a large and persistent drop in average rate spreads for loans near the APR thresholds compared with all other loans, accounting for the included controls. In the last part of my project, I consider a model that allows me to measure borrower and lender welfare under different types of regulations. I'm not going to go through the model itself here due to the limited time we have, but I'll discuss the results and I'm happy to answer questions. In short, I use a standard industrial organization logit demand model. So along with some specific assumptions I make in this case, the results are also based on the standard assumptions that come with logit demand models. For each borrower, I use the data to predict their potential loan offers and predict the prices of those loan offers. The goal of the model is to recover markups or profits for firms. For simplicity in the model, I'm going to treat the threshold as a cap above which firms cannot make loans. So the results should not be interpreted as what would happen if the HOPE APR threshold were lower, but rather as a prediction of what would happen at different levels of a strict APR cap. Incorporating different types of price-based regulation into the model would be more complex and is a possible area for future research. I used data from 2018 and 2019 in the model because I found that the additional variables available in those years were crucial to the accuracy of the model. Therefore, all of my results are for loans with prices below the current HOPA APR thresholds, which make up a vast majority of predicted loan offers in the model. I am simulating an interest rate cap on that part of the market at various levels. I use the model, which is a work in progress, to think through the trade-offs of different levels of an interest rate cap. There are three possibilities of how a given loan offer would be affected by a given level of an interest rate cap. First, if a loan can still be offered profitably under the cap, but is now offered at a lower rate due to the cap, the borrower is better off because of the lower price. If the loan would be offered below the cap anyhow, the borrower is unaffected. If a lender cannot offer a loan profitably under the cap, the borrower is worse off due to having fewer loan options. This graph shows the predicted change in consumer surplus at different levels of the cap. We can see that at first, borrowers are better off due to lower prices, but are eventually worse off due to the decrease in loan supply. For example, we see that at a rate spread threshold of 0, which would correspond to strictly capping manufactured home loan rates at prime mortgage APRs, borrowers are predicted to be much worse off due to the fall in loan supply. I find a higher peak for lower income borrowers. This is partly due to the higher estimated price sensitivity of lower income borrowers and partly due to the lower income borrowers having higher APR loan offers on average. This graph shows the number of loans the model predicts each borrower would be offered if they applied to every lender operating in their county. Looking left to right as the cap falls, the number of loan offers declines slowly at first, then drops off precipitously at lower levels of the cap. Finally, I conduct a simple exercise in which I impose a cap of 4% above the average prime offer rate for low-income borrowers, which is approximately the optimum predicted in the model for low-income borrowers, and plot the predicted change in consumer surplus by state. Since the average markups and distribution of loan offers differ in each state, we can see heterogeneity in the results. For example, the average low-income borrower in Texas is predicted to do quite well under the cap, while the average low-income borrower in Washington state is very close to losing surplus under the predicted nationally optimal cap. Thanks so much for coming today, and now I'll pass it on to Elena.
All right, thank you very much, Helen, and thanks everybody for being here. What I will talk to you about today is the sources of statistics for the U.S. production of factory-built housing, and this is joint work with Jim Schmitz at the Minneapolis Fed. I'm Elena Falcettoni. I'm a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and since I'm part of the board and Jim is part of the Minneapolis Fed, nothing that you will see here today represents the views of the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System as a whole. So what I am going to start with is just giving you an idea of basically what motivated our paper and in particular our data collection, which is really what we're going to talk about today. In particular, basically in the US, we talk about economists or policymakers in general. There's this equivalence in a way between factory-built housing and mobile homes, which are nowadays often called manufactured homes. Now, data on mobile home shipments are readily available through the census. And so people and researchers alike just simply use that as the best proxy for factory-built housing consumption. However, there's actually a lot of different types of factory-built housing, and a lot of them grew pretty much at the same time, but data sources have been limited on the other types other than mobile home shipments. And so to basically overcome this problem, we went ahead and we created a new data collection. And by doing that, we actually went through very old documents all the way from basically the very beginning in the 40s and in particular during the boom of the 60s and the 70s. And we actually got data from sources such as newspapers and magazines and whatnot to then digitalize them and create an actual data set that contains data on all types of factory-built housing and not just mobile homes. And so the key and sort of the upshot of why this is important is that once we actually consider all the different types of factory-built housing, we can see how factory-built housing has been sort of underreported, really, when we look at the work throughout by focusing only on mobile homes or, again, manufactured homes. And in particular, during the boom in the 60s and 70s, the factory share of single-family housing consumption was actually extremely high, reaching 60 to 70%, and it dropped substantially over the years. So really, by accounting for all the different types of housing, we get a much fuller and a much more complete picture of the housing consumption in the US during that time. So to start out, actually, what we need is a little bit of definitions, because there's no doubt that different types of housing have different names used in different contexts. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I just want to sort of set the stage for what I will refer to as I use different terms. So I already talked about mobile homes. These are also talked or referred to as manufactured homes, specifically, especially after the 70s with the hot codes coming around. And again, this group includes every type and size of mobile home. These are basically entirely built in the factory. Roughly 90% of the house will be basically already ready from the factory and then just brought in, basically transported to the site. There's two other types of factory-built homes that I will include today. These are modular homes and prefabricated homes. In the case of modular homes, the home is built in sections that are built in a factory and then transported to the actual location of the house. And so these are about 70% built in factory. And in the case of prefabricated homes, these are either panelized or pre-cut. So they're basically what is built in factories are the panels that are then put together on site. Now, if you think about the other type, of course, other than factory-built home, we have stick-built home, right? But before that, like, how do we actually consider all these types of housing? I refer to as single-family homes, right? These are what I will refer to as I use this term is really single-family housing starts. So we're really talking about sort of the flow over time. And again, these stats come from the census, and you can see on the slide the actual definition from the census. The key sort of thing here that is important to realize is that normally we consider the equivalence between single family housing and stick-built housing, right? The normal homes that you will see built with bricks. However, the truth is that modular and prefabricated homes are included in single family housing starts. So the two are not the same, and stick-built housing is actually the difference between the single family housing starts and the sum of modular and prefabricated housing. And again, why don't we have that today? Because data on modular and prefabricated housing, especially over the years, are poor. And so you will see that, and I will refer back to this when the time comes, but then of course, then we can differentiate between the stick-built housing that I mentioned before by removing modular and prefabricated from single-family housing starts, and factory-built housing that is nothing but the sum of manufactured homes or mobile homes, modular homes, and prefabricated homes. All right, so the first is sort of graph that I show you here is just single family housing starts, and that's just to sort of set the stage. This data is pulled together from 1947 all the way to basically nowadays. This mostly come from the census from 1959. There's been a very regular data collection. Before then, the BLS collected the data, and these were reported in David Deseskin, and there's the reference there. And the key thing here is that the census revised those estimates to make them comparable with the census data set afterwards, okay? Again, this is just to set the stage, and you see sort of the movement here in single family housing, and we'll get back to that toward the end to see how this really compares when we start looking at prefabricated versus stick-built. All right. So going into the data that we pulled together, here you have the first source, which is the National Association of Home Manufacturers. Now, this association actually changed names over time, but the key thing here, and again, there's a whole thing in the draft where we actually talk about the evolution itself of the association and their service. But the key thing here is that they ran their own service and really professional service to collect the data on both the modular and prefabricated housing. Really, the majority of the data that we could collect from NAHM are the total of modular and prefabricated together. There's few cases in which these are separate, but I will not go into those today. So the key thing here is that we're able to collect that really really pretty much during the same period as single family housing, right? And you can see how we get a sort of a fuller picture all the way up to almost the 90s, even though data become more scarce toward the end. Now, there's a different sources that we use. Up to 1969, we used Field and Rifkin to grab this data. From 69 to 72, we found another book that actually reported these NHM statistics, which is right up back. But afterwards, we really only could get it through newspaper articles at the time. And again, this is basically literally just an article reporting that the NHM that, and then they're talking about things and they report what the total reported by the association was. Now, the upshot here is that if you work on mobile home data, or you've ever seen mobile home shipment data, the trend is very similar. There's a boom and then there's a sharp decline. And so you see that that's actually very similar to what we see with this boom growing very sharply in the 60s and 70s to then drop very sharply right then. All right. So a secondary data source that we use that you'll also see today is the Red Book data. The Red Book data, for short, is really the Red Book of Housing Manufacturers data collection. This was a mail questionnaire, but as you can see, it's more limited in the time series focus, as it's only from 1972 to 1988. So it's really just a portion from what we saw before. Now, the key thing that you have to remember as I show you these different sources is that different sources could use different definitions and also different ways of aggregating these different types of housing, right? And so you can see that, for example, the Red Book considers differentiates between 1 to 4 units and 5+ units. We put 1 to 4 together. That's what we focus basically. You do not have statistics on each of the different types. And so you can see that it's not necessarily that they're all comparable, but what you see is that you get an idea of the trends very well by comparing these different data sources, right? So here you see on the left, it's the modular housing graph based on the Red Book, and on the right, you have prefabricating housing. The scales are not the same. Just to give you an idea, as you can see, prefabricating housing was higher at the time, which matches other sources. We really focus for the rest of the presentation, especially on the sum of the two, so that we'll also see the compare it against the NIHM data. But in the paper, in the draft, once we release it, you see that we also do a lot of comparisons specifically within modular and within prefabricated. Another data source that I want to talk to you about is the so-called AIH data. AIH data stands for Automation in Housing, and it's based actually on the subscribers of a particular magazine that is Automation in Housing and Manufactured Home Dealers. Now, the subscribers actually represent about 90% of all housing starts, but the key thing here is that AIH really cannot be used for prefabricated housing. And the reason for that, without going into specifics, is that basically the definition that they use is very different, and in the includes in prefabricating housing, any home that had any part built in a factory, even if it was a very, very small percentage of the home. So the two are really not comparable relative to the other definitions. So what you see here is the modular housing instead specifically for AIH. And again, because we focus on just the sum today on modular and prefabricated, we will really not focus on AIH at all because of their definitional issues. All right, then one thing before we go into the total is that I would like to show you here in this next graph the comparison in mobile home data that we have from the census, again, what we always use, relative to the mobile home data reported in AIH and Red Book. And the reason that I show you this is that you might tell me, well, maybe the data set, and so the data sources are basically not as reliable. And so the only thing that we have as a metrical comparison, right, is really mobile home shipments, because those have been collected from the census for basically as long as all these other publications existed. And so what you see here is that between 1972 and 1988, all three, the census, AIH, and Red Book, were reporting their own counts of mobile home shipments based on all these different methodologies. And so what I'm trying to tell you here, the upshot is, look how close they are, right? Like, even though these publications were actually using different methods for mobile home shipments, which is the only statistic that the three of them all report, they're extremely close. And so this actually gives us a lot of confidence and makes us feel that the data that we're putting together is highly reliable. All right, so for the rest of this presentation, I'm really going to talk to you about the total on modular and prefabricating housing and the share of that relative to single-family housing. So again, what you see here in the graph, you see three different types. So the dotted green, the dashed red, and the solid black. So the solid black starts from 1992, and that's basically the only data reported on modular and prefabricated by the census, which is 92 to today. And then the others are the other data I talked to you about. And in particular, the green one is the AHM, and red book is the sum of, and the red one is from the red book for the sum of prefabricated and modular. And what you see here is the data we got, even with NHM, even if it gets so sporadic, it really matches that trend, right? You can really get this full picture of what happened, this sort of extreme rise and sharp decline. And what is interesting here is that now, what I'll show you in this next graph is that that's basically the same graph, but now we're putting mobile homes in there as well. And so we're really looking at all factory-built housing, modular, prefabricated, and mobile homes. And what you see here, so the blue alternating solid and dotted, that's mobile homes only. So when we policymakers, economists, always use mobile home shipments as the proxy for the entire factory-built housing, that's what we use. We just use the blue. And instead, the other lines that you see is the total factory-built housing by using all the data that we collected together with mobile homes. And so you can see that using mobile homes only really understates the amount of factory-built housing used to the level that it is often twice, if not even 3 times at the peak, as many factory-built homes as mobile homes only. So the understatement is significant. So related to this, as I mentioned, we also want to look at that relative to stick-built, right? So stick-built, again, is take the total of single-family housing and remove modular and prefabricated housing, which is included in that count. And now what you see here is that everything that is in black, whether it's dashed or dotted or solid, that's just a factory-made housing, and everything that is red is stick-built. And so what is key here is that you can really see the factory-built housing, once you actually consider the modular and prefabricated on top of the mobile homes, became really, really significant in the 60s and 70s, to the point of being higher than the stick-built housing consumed at the time. And you can see that the two are really sort of going in opposite trends, right? So factory-built housing was winning when stick-built housing was dropping. And then when factory-built housing started dropping because of different policies and interventions, stick-built housing went back up. And so the other way that we can see that is thinking about the share of factory-built housing over time. And this is really the last thing that I'll show you today. And by doing that, what we take is basically, what is the total housing consumption? Total housing consumption is the stick-built housing plus all the factory-built housing, right? So that includes the stick-built housing, modular, prefabricated, and mobile homes. And so if we think of that and then take the share of factory-built, which is factory-built housing over that total, we can see how important factory-built housing was for the single-family housing consumption, right? And so what you see here is that at its boom during the 60s and 70s, this share was huge. It went all the way up to basically 70%, and then it dropped to the 10% level that we see nowadays. So while today we think of factory-built housing as a very, very, very small share of housing needs, we really, of housing consumption rather, you really see that it was extremely important throughout the decades, and it was really booming before sort of gradually declining to today's levels. And so once again, by just using mobile homes as the best proxy for factory-built homes, this is vastly underestimated. And so I'll conclude basically here. The idea is that we really created this new data set by collecting data from a number of sources, reports, magazines, and newspapers, putting them all together. And we showed that by using only mobile homes as the best proxy for factory-built homes, economists and policymakers alike vastly underestimate the importance of factory-built homes over the decades. And that, of course, really matters in terms of understanding whether factory-built housing could be used also for policy interventions. And with that, I'm looking forward to any questions that the audience might have, but I'll hand it over to Astou for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is a pleasure to share some insights about this research, and I'm Astou, an economist here at Freddie Mac. All right, so today's agenda, I am going to start with a discussion of the motivation behind this work, what our objectives are, the data set that we used, and then I'll switch to discussing our analysis on COVID and loan forbearances, COVID and loan delinquencies, and I'll end with some concluding remarks. So this work is in part motivated by the financial instability and the economic vulnerability that the pandemic has imposed. Many people experienced a lot of financial hardships, which led to budget trade-offs. And so for many households, it was a choice between paying your mortgage or having that money go towards other necessary expenses. The effect of the pandemic is, however, uneven as some demographics were more impacted. Now, in terms of geography, high needs rural regions are really characterized by persistent poverty and low economic opportunities. And so the effect of COVID was really intensified in that area, which means that a lot of people in that area had difficulties paying their mortgages. Now, in response to the pandemic, some relief programs were enacted. However, manufactured homeowners were sometimes excluded from these programs or they had to meet more stringent criteria. So, if we're looking at the CARES Act, for example, it imposed some restrictions around the financing of manufactured housing as well as the loan type. For example, manufactured home mortgages that were federally backed could only qualify for CARES Act forbearance at the discretion of the lender and according to the lender's terms. Now, if we're looking at the HEROES Act and the Homeowners Assistance Fund, these two acts offered more protection for manufactured homeowners, but the Homeowners Assistance Fund, for instance, has yet to be implemented by many states. In fact, it's only 22 states that are accepting applications, and so a lot of manufactured homeowners are still waiting to take advantage of this program. Now, in light of everything that has been said, we conducted this research to study the performance, and by performance, I mean forbearance and delinquency of manufactured homeowners during the pandemic. This research is also going to investigate loan performance in high needs rural regions, and I'm going to go over the definition of high needs rural regions in later slides. Now, our statistical analysis is also going to allow us to identify the key variables that are associated with the likelihoods of forbearance and delinquency. Okay, now the first step, of course, is to identify a source of data. And so for this analysis, we are going to use the National Mortgage Database, NMDB. And NMDB is a nationally representative 1 in 20 random sample of all mortgages in the US. This dataset is actually quite rich. It has information about loan and borrower characteristics, which we are going to use in our analysis. Now, if you notice, what I'm doing here is I'm tracking a trend over time. And so I'm tracking trends in forbearance and delinquency over time. And what that really means for us is that from an empirical standpoint, I would like to ideally observe the same loan both before and during the pandemic, which means that we're going to restrict our sample to loans that are active from the first quarter of 2015 to the first quarter of 2022. So this analysis is going to focus on two time periods. The first time period is what we call the pre-pandemic period. And this is going to go from anything before the first quarter of 2020. So essentially from the first quarter of 2015 to the last quarter of 2019. And we also defined a COVID period, which is going to go from the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2022. And now my main variables of interest relate to forbearance. And forbearance is a binary 0-1 variable where a 1 indicates that a loan is in forbearance. The measure of delinquency that we are using here is the 90 days or more delinquency. This also is an indicator variable, which is going to tell us whether the loan is 90 days or more delinquent. Now, we have two types of properties in this analysis. We have manufactured homes and site-built homes. We also define three regions based on census tracts. So rural regions are divided into high needs rural and other rural areas. High needs rural regions include Lower Mississippi, the Middle Appalachia, and 2017 CDFI persistent poverty counties. Now, other rural areas include all of the rural regions that are not high needs, and everything that's not rural is going to be a metro area. In this analysis, we're also going to include loan and borrower characteristics. The loan characteristics that we include relate to debt to income ratio, interest rate, loan to value ratio. We also included borrower characteristics related to age, credit score, income, race and ethnicity, first time home buyer, and as well as an indicator for owner occupancy status. Okay, so now I am going to switch gears and tell you guys specifically the analysis we did on COVID and loan forbearances. So as a starting point, we considered a descriptive analysis. And so this graph here is showing quarterly trends in forbearance by property type. We have a delimiter here. So this dotted line represents the start of COVID. Everything before this line happened before the pandemic, and everything after it happened during COVID. And what we're seeing here is that before COVID, forbearance is really low and similar for both manufactured and site-built homes. However, when COVID started, forbearance increased for both manufactured and site-built homes. However, the increase is actually higher for site-built homes. And so manufactured homeowners had lower forbearances during the pandemic. But we're noticing that in late 2020, early 2021, forbearance started decreasing for both manufactured and site-built homes, which is to be expected as forbearance has a time limit. So next, I'm showing here quarterly trends in forbearance by region. And again, we have the same delimiter here. And what we are saying is that before the pandemic, forbearance is similar everywhere. But when COVID started, forbearance increased in all three regions. But the increase is actually highest in metro areas, which may has to do with the progression of the pandemic because metro areas were impacted first. Now, starting early 2021, late 2020, we are seeing that forbearance by region is also decreasing and forbearance rates are approaching their pre-pandemic levels. Okay. Now, aside from property type and geography, we also have some other variables that impact the probability of forbearance. And so the descriptive statistics alone do not provide an accurate measure of the relationship between property type, geography, and forbearance. And so what I'm going to do here is I am going to use a latent variable approach to model the probability of a loan being in forbearance. And I'm going to do that controlling for a set of influencer variables. Because forbearance is binary 0-1, I'm going to exploit that binary nature by using binary choice models. I'm going to use the pooled probability estimator as well as the panel random effects model. And here, because a lot of the variables are recorded at origination, there is not much within variation, which means that the random effects estimator is superior. Now, if we're looking at the previous equation that I showed, the covariance between x and the error term is not zero because we have endogeneity here. People do self-select into manufactured housing. And so we are also exploring instrumental variable and control function approaches to get causal estimates. Okay, now what did I find? So our preliminary results indicate that if we look at the entire study period, manufactured home loans actually have a lower probability of forbearance compared to loans that are linked to site-built properties. Now, if I'm looking at what happened during COVID, the effect of manufactured housing on forbearance has the same direction. It's still negative. However, it's even higher in magnitude. So during the pandemic, manufactured homeowners had a 1.1% lower probability of forbearance. Now, during the pandemic, the likelihood of any loan being in forbearance is higher. So, whether the loan is linked to a site built property or whether it's linked to a manufactured house, its probability of being in forbearance was higher during the pandemic. Now, all of these effects are statistically significant, at least at the 5% level. Now, in terms of geography, what I'm finding is that loans that are located in high needs areas were as likely as loans that were located in metro areas to be in forbearance during the pandemic. However, if I interact power type and geography, what we're finding is that during the pandemic, manufactured home loans that are located in high needs areas actually had a lower probability of forbearance compared to loans that are linked to site built properties in high needs areas. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to discussing the analysis we did on COVID and delinquency. So again, I'm going to start here with a descriptive analysis. And here, this graph is showing quarterly trends in delinquency by property type. And we have this delimiter here, this dotted line, which represents the start of COVID. And what we are seeing is that before the pandemic, delinquency was low and similar for both manufactured and site-built homes. However, when the pandemic started, delinquency really increased for manufactured homes. And so the difference between delinquency rates between these two property types reached a maximum of 3%, and that was during the first quarter of 2021. Now, this increase in delinquency rates for manufactured homeowners may have something to do with reporting because we know that, for instance, if you took advantage of CARES Act forbearance, your loan was not reported as delinquent. And so, if manufactured homeowners were taking advantage of forbearance at a lower rate, then they might have their loans being reported in delinquency at a higher rate, assuming that they were not offered alternatives that had the same reporting benefits. So this graph here is showing us quarterly trends in delinquency by region. And what we are seeing is that delinquency has traditionally been higher in high needs areas. And this is true both before and during the pandemic. And this has something to do with higher poverty rates and low economic opportunities in high needs areas. But interestingly, we're saying that when COVID started, delinquency decreased everywhere, which again may hint to reporting here. Just like with forbearance, we also have some variables that impact the probability of a loan being a delinquent. And so we are going to use the same approach, which is a latent variable approach, to measure the probability that a loan is going to be delinquent, controlling for a set of variables. Now, given that our data set is panel and delinquency is also a binary variable, I'm going to use a discrete choice model. I will use the pooled probit and the panel random FX probit for the same reasons that I discussed before. And again, here self-selection is present, meaning that we are going to have endogeneity. And so we are also exploiting, or we are also seeing other ways to get causal results by using instrumental variables and control functions. Okay, so our preliminary results are showing us that if we control for loan and borrower characteristics, manufactured homes actually have a lower probability of being 90 plus day delinquent. And we're also seeing that loans that are located in high needs areas have a lower probability of delinquency as well. Now, during the pandemic, the probability of delinquency is higher, and this is true for manufactured homes and site-built homes. We also see that loans, excuse me, we also see that loans that are in high needs areas had a slightly higher probability of delinquency relative to those that are in metros. And this, again, is going to be linked to higher poverty rates and low economic opportunities in high needs areas. Now, in terms of geography, what we are saying is that if we interact geography and property types, manufactured home loans that are in high needs areas actually have a lower probability of delinquency. So in conclusion, this work really shed light on the performance of manufactured homes and site-built homes during the pandemic, as well as loan performance in high needs areas. And to sum up, what we found is that during COVID, the probability of any loan being in forbearance or being delinquent is higher relative to pre-COVID, and that manufactured homeowners actually have lower probabilities of forbearance and delinquency, and this is after controlling for loan and borrower characteristics. We also found that during the pandemic, there is no statistically significant differences in the overall likelihoods of forbearance in high needs rural regions and metro areas. And so loans that are in high needs areas are as likely as loans that are in metros to be in forbearance. We also found that during the pandemic, manufactured homeowners also had an even lower probability of forbearance and a lower probability of delinquency, and that loans that are linked to manufactured homes in high needs areas also had lower probabilities of forbearance and delinquency. And loans that are in high needs areas and other rural areas have a higher probability of delinquency during the pandemic, which again hints to the lower economic opportunities in that area. Now, I'm just going to end by saying that forbearance and delinquency are related processes. And so we are exploring ways to model them together to account for any linkage that might happen in the two error terms of the equations that I showed. And this is all I have. I'm going to hand it over to Lariece.
Thank you, Astou. And thank you to all of our panelists today, Lesli, Helen, and Elena. Very interesting presentations, a lot of great insights there. Before I go into my final closing comments, let's see if we have questions that we can take a few of these from the chat or from the Q&A box today. Let's see what we have. I believe our presenters can see the chat box as well, but let me see what I have here. See something about millennials here. I'm going to start with a question. Looks like this one might be for Lesli, given I see millennials in this question. Let's see. Given that many millennials are open to manufactured homes and are taking more leadership positions in local and state governments, are you seeing more opportunities now? And what are the remaining barriers to more use of manufactured housing?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think it's a really important question because a lot of our headwinds as manufactured housing actually comes from government regulation. The prior presenter talked about the HMDA results when it comes to availability of mortgage credit. And this is something that, as the Manufactured Housing Institute, we were really concerned about. When the Dodd-Frank Act passed, and established those HOPA thresholds, we actually showed through the HMDA data in the same years that Helen was indicating that there was a precipitous drop in lending for manufactured housing, particularly when it came to those lower cost manufactured homes. The Fed actually in 2014 issued an analysis of the 2014 HMDA data, and they called the decline in manufactured home loans, quote, a precipitous drop in the number of loans originated at the HOPA price threshold. And they said, whereas for 2013, before the new threshold rules took effect, no such discontinuity was evident. This pattern suggests HOPA discouraged lending above price thresholds. What we saw was that there was a decrease in manufactured homes that were available. And so this government regulation actually harmed access to credit. And so when you talk about millennials, I just want to take it first and say, you know, all of these regulations matter and the impact of these regulations matter. I don't think you can suggest that that the one firm that continued somehow was harming consumers. They were the only lender left providing this essentially because so many other, remember, HMDA data doesn't capture all lenders. Community banks also stopped making HMDA loans at that time. So I'm glad that this is a conversation that's taking place with Freddie Mac because the availability of financing is critical for all for everyone when you're talking about those kinds of government barriers that prevent individuals from becoming homeowners through manufactured housing. So financing clearly is a barrier, and we commend Freddie Mac for rolling up their sleeves and looking at a way to address it. The second point that I will make is with respect to another government regulation, this time at the state and local level, and this has to do with zoning. There are many areas of the country where you see that because of the stigma against manufactured housing, the zoning policies do not allow for the placement of manufactured homes. We're hopeful that as millennials and the younger generation consumers do populate those boards or those local governments, that we will see a shift. We also believe that with the quality of our houses today, that you are going to see that more localities say, yes, please bring us more manufactured homes because they are beautiful and they will provide that quality, attainable homeownership price point that is really lacking right now in a lot of localities. So again, I think it's government regulation. It's sometimes well-intentioned, but oftentimes it has negative impacts. And that's what we see when we are dealing with this affordable housing crisis nationwide. Thanks, Lariece.
Thank you, Lesli. Always helpful to hear your perspective coming from MHI. I really appreciate that. Helen's paper has also stimulated quite a bit of activity here in the Q&A box. Let me start with this one because it's kind of tied back to what some of Leslie's comments just now. It says here, for the pricing analysis, do the authors see the results appearing similar by loan amount, or does loan amount matter? Given the comments related to this one says, I'm wondering because lower loan amounts might make it easier to trigger higher APRs.
So thanks, Lariece. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but the threshold for the APR threshold depends on loan amounts. So there's a higher APR threshold for loans that are less than $50,000 that are chattel loans. So the threshold there is 8.5%, and the threshold that the lower threshold for higher loan amounts is 6.5% rate spread. If you're asking about whether I see a change in loan amounts due to the HOPA rule, I don't see evidence of that. And the other paper in the HOPA rule literature that looks at that as well, the Benzardi paper, also does not see an effect on changes in loan amounts.
Interesting. There's a lot of research that has been done, but perhaps even more could be done there as well. Helen, I've got one more here that maybe we can let you take before I go on to some of these other research-related questions. It says here the results seem to focus, excuse me, on the dominant firm. Do you get a sense of the extent to which the remaining firms are able to remain competitive given the dominant firm's apparent market power? Does the dominant firm's market share change over time in your analysis?
Yeah, so I have to look back at the data, but my memory is that it sort of increased and then decreased a little bit over time nationally. So I think one reason I focus on the dominant firm in the paper is that since they made such a large share of loans that were affected by the HOPA APR thresholds in the year before implementation, understanding this firm's response to the HOPA APR threshold is important to understanding the response to APR threshold in the market as a whole. And as you kind of suggested, if we only look at market-wide averages, it's hard to see the response of other firms since they made up a small share of lending above the APR threshold in the year prior to implementation.
See, there are some questions here for our other presenters as well. Let's bring Elena into the conversation. I see you in here, looks like on the data part. Why do you think there's a drop in the share of factory-built homes as a share of single-family housing starts? And do you see any implications for affordable housing or affordable housing needs in particular? Elena?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lariece. That is an absolutely excellent question. There are many reasons for sure, and a little bit sometimes it depends on the type of housing, and we definitely are exploring many different discussion points that we'll bring into the draft. But there were definitely certain policy interventions that made the factory-built housing, quote unquote, less attractive, and in particular also less affordable. One such example is that in the case of manufactured homes, for example, the mandatory chassis requirement is something that increased the cost of manufactured homes substantially. There are also other things, of course, the zoning requirements that started coming up quite in a stricter way in the 70s, obliging manufactured homes to be in certain places. And there's also other things that people might have heard of is, for example, mortgage issues relating to just even Astou just talking about it in her fantastic research on COVID. Mortgage was a particularly sort of thorny issue at the time because beforehand, all factory-built homes could go under normal mortgages, and then, for example, manufactured homes had to go under vehicle loans. So there's many different sort of policy interventions that led to that, making factory-built homes less affordable, and in certain cases, in a way, less desirable, right? Like, for example, if zoning brings away from certain places, you might not want to live there anymore. So I think that the second part of your question is really what we're focusing on, which is really what does that mean for affordable housing? If we think about who in general would be more inclined to buy factory-built homes, there's no doubt that we're talking about low-income families. There's also no doubt that we're talking about minorities often in the US. The two groups often, unfortunately, coincide. And so really addressing and understanding better what the implication of all these different policies was in terms of changing the way that factory-built homes could be a solution potentially to affordable housing could be really important for us as policymakers, right? For us to understand what could be done and whether factory-built homes could be a solution to the affordable housing problem in the United States. And so that is spot on what we're working on, and what we're hoping to use also this data set for is to actually relate this to affordable housing issues throughout the decades and understanding how this could be used. So stay tuned for more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. I do look forward to more. Thank you with that data set. Let's try to squeeze in one more question because I haven't picked on Astou yet, and it looks like there's something in here for her. What were the main drivers of the differences you initially observed in manufactured housing delinquency relative to site built and/or forbearance rates? Any insights into what could have been driving those differences?
Thank you, Lariece. So that is an excellent question. So what our preliminary results are showing is that when we look at loan characteristics, for instance, interest rate is going to have a positive impact on the probability of forbearance. And so loans that have a higher interest rate have a higher likelihood of being in forbearance. Now, in terms of borrower characteristics, what we are saying is that age has a negative impact on the likelihood of forbearance, which means that older borrowers have a lower probability of being in forbearance. Now, for delinquency, we see that a lot of the drivers of forbearance are also going to drive the probability of delinquency. However, the effect sometimes goes in opposite direction. If we look at age, for instance, while age has a negative impact on forbearance, we found that it has a positive impact on delinquency, which means that older borrowers have a higher probability of being delinquent. And of course, these are preliminary results, and stay tuned for more as well.
Thanks, Astou. Thank you, Astou. I'm looking forward to that. That is all the time we have for questions in this session. Because your questions are very important to us, if we did not get to your question, we will follow up sometime after the symposium. I do have a discussion and recap points, a few points here for the presenters and fellow researchers who may be on the line today. I just want to recap a little bit. Leslie's data kicking off this session about millennials' attitudes and affordability constraints is eye-opening given the size of the millennial consumer base. According to the National Association of Realtors, millennials represent the largest share of home buyers at 43% in 2021. And according to our own tabulation of anonymized credit bureau data, there are 26 million millennial mortgage-ready consumers. That would be those who do not currently have a mortgage, but have credit attributes that suggest they could be in a position to qualify for a mortgage. Several research studies peg the housing supply shortage in the U.S. at 1 to 3 million homes, a number that was growing in 2020 before housing starts improved and then cooled off again, according to the National Association of Home Builders. This, combined with the openness of millennials to consider manufactured homes as a housing option, represents an opportunity for the future of our housing supply and home affordability. That initial presentation provides the perfect setup for the deep dives in the remaining working papers. The evidence related to loan performance, market challenges, and key solution drivers is still being developed. Therefore, I want to thank Helen for looking at the potential impacts of policy, pricing regulation on lending in manufactured housing markets. And as a reminder, this rigorous analysis was done even before Helen started her current tenure at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I found it interesting that in the short term, interest rates fall for borrowers with no evidence that the largest firm made changes to loan amount, borrower income, or other attributes to compensate. Also, the additional analysis using more recent and comprehensive data shows that more restrictive caps could negatively impact borrowers. To understand the more holistic impact, it would be helpful to have a view into how other firms are impacted by the caps. How does their share of lower loan balance loans, for instance, which are more likely to trigger APR thresholds, compare to that of the largest lender? What about the effects on other lenders' ability to continue operating in this market and scale further into the lower loan balance segments? The author has looked into some of this perspective. Most of the manufactured housing market does not have as much of a secondary market activity as the broader real property mortgage market. What is the impact to the volumes of lenders who may not have access to less expensive capital? Are they able to stay in business, maintain share, for instance? This sort of research and analysis provided in this paper is important, especially combined with other evidence and important information about the impact of policy. Elena and her co-author take on the daunting task of assembling a historical and comprehensive data set of factory-built housing going back to 1947. While others confuse the categories of non-site built homes, this work helps to highlight the variety and clarify the differences. It is fascinating that factory-built homes represented as much as 3/4 of single-family homes compared to just 10% today. And given that factory-built homes are double just the manufactured home alone starts, they could be considered an important part of the housing supply discussion. In line with Helen's discussion of pricing policy effects, it is important that Elena mentioned a separate paper with more on what may have led to the decline of the various types of factory-built homes over time, and she hinted at that a bit in the Q&A discussion. I would trust that the various data sources represent housing starts as presented. I do wonder what is the best way to think about the housing stock or the existing stock of single-family homes at various points in time. Are there differences in durability, resale potential, appreciation, or depreciation across the various types of factory-built homes that have implications for the current stock? Do the data sources include information to help us understand anything about location? Were certain types of factory-built homes more concentrated in certain parts of the country? Oh, the questions I can think of when a new data set becomes available. Very excited about that. And finally, on our final paper presentation, Astou uses loan performance data that spans the time period before and after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic and regulation was enacted aiming to offer protection for consumers affected by the virus. During COVID, mortgage holders with site-built homes were more likely to take a forbearance compared to those manufactured home loans. It is interesting that forbearance rates were lower in high-needs rural areas in the initial stages of the pandemic in the descriptive analysis, but declined more rapidly in metro areas. Thinking about extensions, as I always like to, it would be interesting if a researcher could do more to tease out this pattern by perhaps bringing in data on infection rates by time or local employment statistics. It is interesting that these geographical differences are not statistically significant in the model while the property type differences in forbearance persist. Given that manufactured housing has a lower probability of forbearance, it is encouraging that this is not translating to a higher likelihood of delinquency in the model results. I believe that the data set does have some additional information that could be helpful, digging into maybe how mortgage holders are doing with other trade lines and maybe tease out the extent to which these consumers are actually distressed, again, in an extension, of course. I'm also encouraged by Astou's mention of other empirical estimation methods that could be help refine this analysis, such as exploring the instrumental variable approach, or even looking at tying these two outcomes together. Looking forward to that research going forward. With that, we must wrap up. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for participating. To all of you, please take a few moments to take our brief survey so that we can continue to enhance our symposium with your feedback. The presentation deck will be available to you following the session, and you can also log in anytime after the conference to play back this or any other session for this conference. At this time, we'll take a 15-minute break and return for the final session of the conference, Housing Affordability, Rural Rental Markets. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.